over 87.3% of you guys aren't subscribed. So what are you doing? If you like the podcast, make sure you subscribe. It helps the channel out. Now let's get into. So how are you, Aaron?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. It's a pleasure to have you on. And obviously, you travel across America to different states covering the UFC. How was that like?
Well, it's a great experience. Anytime you get to travel, it's certainly a blessing to get to check out all the different cities where the UFC bring their shows. The more the merrier. I'm always happy to check out new cities, especially. It feels like the last time I was in a new city that I hadn't been to before has been, I guess probably a little bit because they haven't been traveling all that much. But hopefully they continue to go to more cities and I can see more of the world.
Is there any cities you particularly like going to, like recurring events?
I really like Chicago. Chicago is a
Yeah.
city that I've always really enjoyed going to. I think, a very underrated city.
Obviously, going to all these different UFC events. Is there any particular one fight you like to talk to interviewing?
Israel's really good. I mean, he's just very honest, and you don't really see interviews where he says the same thing twice. Like it seems like he's very thoughtful in all of his answers and doesn't really have kind of prepackaged responses to things. And I always really appreciate that.
Yeah, it always seems like he has something else to say, whether it's about his opponent or about the division.
Yeah, and I think that he'll give you what you give him. So if you don't have very good questions prepared for him, I don't think that he's going to give you very good answers. But if you make him think, that's where I think you can really get the most out of him. Like if you have thought-provoking questions.
Yeah, well, we see in the cage how he's a really creative fighter, and I'm sure his response are the same.
Yeah, for sure. He's always got interesting takes on things, and he's always, again, very honest and is not afraid to, speak openly about whatever's on his mind. In a very, I think, refreshing way.
You say he's the like biggest fighter you've had the pleasure to interview.
I've interviewed Conor. I think he's probably the biggest fighter in the history of the sport. So that's probably number one in terms of profile. If you're looking at the fighters, I mean, it just doesn't get any bigger than him really in the history of the UFC.
Yeah, how is it like interviewing Conor, such a huge superstar?
He's another guy that is very thoughtful in his responses. He doesn't really have canned answers, and I think that that's why he became such a big star. Is that he's always been himself. He doesn't try to be something he's not.
Obviously, you got the UFC New York Madison Square Garden program in the background of your setup. Is there any event that you've covered or been a part of that's been the most memorable?
Um, I don't know about most memorable. I think that they all have kind of different things that stand out. You know what? Actually, I have a better answer than that. UFC 223 was the most memorable fight week. That was the fight week where originally it was supposed to be Ferguson versus Khabib, and then it was Max Holloway versus Khabib, and then Conor came to town and threw the dolly through the bus, and I was like there throughout all of things that were going on, and just getting to experience just a fight week that had so many different things happen in the span of 1 week was really memorable. Just having to chase the stories and be on top of things, going to the courthouse, like just that week was just one that I think will always be memorable to me.
Yeah, I remember as a fan, with like you said, Fergus pulling out, then Holloway having to pull out due to weight cutting on the day of the weigh-in. As a fan, it was hectic to keep part of.
Yeah, and the event itself wasn't like anything particularly special, really. Like when it came down to it, like you're talking about Ally Akinta against Khabib as the main event. It was more just the lead up to it. I think that really made it a special fight week.
Yeah, definitely. How did you get into like MMA, covering MMA and reporting on it? Who inspired you?
I don't know if there's anybody in particular that inspired me. I've always just loved broadcasting as a whole. Like I've always been a real fan of the craft. And growing up, I always wanted to be on radio. Like that was my goal as a kid, was to be a radio host or a radio DJ or something along those lines. Because I always just really enjoyed listening to the radio, listening to people have different styles of broadcasting. And I took journalism after I went to university for communications, and decided to make that my path, and was mostly behind the scenes for many years, and eventually transitioned to on air because when it came to the staff that we had at TSN, I was by far the most knowledgeable of mixed martial arts. And when we got the rights to the UFC, they really wanted to have somebody who knew what they were talking about running the UFC content. So I kept asking, we got to cover the sport more. We've got to cover the sport more. And they just put me in charge of it.
So were you always a fan of the sport before you started covering it?
Oh, yeah. For many years. I've been a fan of the sport for probably almost 20 years now.
Pretty much since it started, really, 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe a little bit less than 20 years when I think about it, but it's close. So it's,
How do you
I've been a fan for a while.
how do you find that transition from being someone backstage to now being the main guy on camera?
I didn't find it to be all that daunting, to be honest. Like I've never been that shy. I've never had trouble speaking with people. So the strategy that I used when I first started doing this was like, what can I do better than people that are covering the sport now? And I thought that the thing that I could do best was really focus on how I dress nicely for the job, really bring a level of professionalism to what I was doing. And I think that I was able to do that pretty quickly. But because I made that my focus, it took a lot of pressure off of the rest of the job for me. Like I was very focused on how I dressed, how I looked, and how I was presenting myself. So that took away a lot of the nerves of actually speaking to people because I was focusing more on that. And I also had to, I shoot and record and edit all of my own stuff. So that was another thing that was kind of stressing me out, was the technical aspect of it, making sure things were recording. So because I had the stress of all of those different things, it really alleviated the stress of actually doing the job, because it's a lot easier for me to stand in front of a camera and talk to another person than it is to, work all of the different technology around it. That was never really my area of expertise. So because I was so focused on those things, I think it actually took a lot of the pressure off of me from doing the interviews themselves.
Obviously, you and the Schmo are always looking dapper whenever you're doing interviews or at press conferences.
Well, I think it's a different kind of style. He's a lot more flashy than I am.
Yeah, definitely. How do you feel like MMA's media evolved since you got into this scene?
Sorry, I missed that, Jay. Go ahead.
And how do you feel like MMA media has evolved from when you started reporting to how it is now, going more mainstream?
Yeah. Well, seeing ESPN get really involved with it, I think really steps it up a notch, because, here in North America, especially in the US, ESPN and TSN here in Canada are like the gold standard for sports coverage. So I think that because of that, it has really made the UFC a lot more mainstream. And in doing so, I think it's made the standards of covering the sport a lot higher.
Yeah, like you said before about dressing well for the job, see that more now with it going more mainstream, more people wearing suits to press conferences to other media events.
Yeah, I think maybe that's changed a little bit more than when I started, I guess. But I think the person that has covered the sport better really than anybody else, and has been doing it for such a long time, is Ariel Helwani, and he's never worried that much about wearing suits. He's more of like a plaid shirt and jeans guy, and there's no problem with that. But I think that before I came onto the scene and started covering it, I think that a lot of people were just dressing very casually in doing this job, which again, it's not really a problem. But for me, my goal has always been to really elevate the sport in Canada, and I feel like by dressing professionally and making sure that I look good on camera really helps raise it in that regard. And again, it's not a knock on anybody who doesn't do it, but I think that when you look at all of the other sports and how people dress when they're covering those sports, you see it's more of a buttoned up look. So I really wanted to bring that ethos to the job.
Talking about elevating the sport in Canada, the man behind you, Joe St. Pierre, has done a brilliant job of that. What's he done for Canadian MMA?
He's the one who brought everybody into the sport. Like, I don't think that the UFC is as popular in Canada today, if not for George St. Pierre being the biggest star in the sport for a time and being on pretty much everybody's Mount Rushmore of the best fighters of all time. And I think the approach in which he did it in such a gentlemanly fashion, respectful of the martial arts, and conducting himself as such a gentleman throughout. And again, you talk about dressing well at press conferences. Like, George was always dressed to the nines when people were showing up to press conferences in t-shirts and jeans, even on the fighter side of things. So I think that in that regard, he really leveled up the professionalism and the respect of the sport by being such a great face for the sport from Canada.
Would you say George St. Pierre is the greatest of all time?
Personally, I still think John Jones is the greatest of all time. I said that even before he won the heavyweight championship, so I can't change my answer now. But I think that George is certainly should be in every single person's top three if you're making a list of the best of all time.
Who would you say is the top three? Obviously, you mentioned John Jones, St. Pierre, who's the third man on the list.
It varies, but gun to my head, I'd probably say Anderson Silva would be number 3 on that list. For people that were following the sport and fans of the sport during his title reign, it was really a special thing that I think a lot of people don't really realize if you're kind of newer to the sport and you saw the latter stage of Anderson Silva's career. But Anderson Silva was an absolute force and was just completely dominating everybody. So if I had to pick a number 3, I think I'd probably go with Anderson.
We see the highlights of Anderson when he got inducted to the Hall of Fame. I think, the head movement was so unique to Anderson, and obviously the counter punch too.
Yeah, I mean, Anderson stylistically is still, I think, one of the greatest strikers of all time. Incredible timing, like you said, incredible head movement, incredible instincts, high fight IQ. People forget when he lost to Weidman, I think he was like 38 or 39 years old. So he had pretty good longevity in terms of what his age was when he was the champion. He became a champion fairly late in the game. So I think people sometimes disregard that. But man, he was just so much better than the rest of the middleweights during the time where he was in his prime.
If you could matchmake and put one fight of like the old era in their prime versus someone in the more modern era in their prime, who would you have?
We already saw this fight, but I think a prime Anderson Silva against a prime Israel Adesanya would be an unbelievable fight to watch. Oh man, that's one where I would love to see. I mean, you could also look at like a prime St. Pierre versus prime Usman, but personally, I think the more fun fight would be Israel versus Anderson Silva. Again, but a fight we've already seen, but we saw Anderson Silva at age 44, 45 take on Israel. If we saw him 10 years younger against Israel, that would be probably one of the greatest fights ever.
We saw how technical it was, though. Like you say, Anderson being 45 and still gave Izzy a run for his money. Granted, it was a unanimous decision.
Yeah, it was still a fairly competitive fight, but I think it's pretty clear who won it.
Yeah, obviously going into 2023, what would you say your favorite fight has been this far?
Thus far this year?
Yeah.
It's a good question. I'm trying to think of what we've seen. I mean, Volkanovski versus Islam was an unbelievable fight, like about as high level a fight as you'll ever see. So I would probably go with that off the top of my head.
I mean, that would be most people's choice. You had the champ element with Volkanovski going up and then going to a decision, pushing Islam the furthest anyone ever has done.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps it's not the most exciting fight that we saw this year. It was entertaining, but if you're looking for most exciting, that's probably not it. But in terms of just high level, great fight, I think that is probably at the top of my list for this year so far.
Is there any fights or events that you're looking forward to, being a part of and reporting on?
Well, I'm looking forward to John Jones versus Stipe, whenever that is. Chandler versus Conor is going to be an unbelievable fight week, so I'm looking forward to just covering that fight. I'm hoping we get to see Poirier versus Gaethje too sometime this year. There's a lot to look forward to in 2023. I think they're trying really hard to make good fights to commemorate the 30th year of the UFC. So I think we're going to see a lot of good stuff as the year winds down.
The Conor Chandler fight, the first round will be so explosive. See how both men are in the first round.
I mean, if it gets past the first round, it'll be as explosive for as long as the fight lasts. I think that's going to be an amazing fight.
How do you see that one going down? Probably be later on this year.
Yeah, if I had to guess, I think it'll be in September, but it could also be in December for their year-end card. So we'll have to see how that shakes out. But yeah, I think that I'd be hard pressed to pick. I know Chandler's the underdog, but I'd be hard pressed to pick against Michael Chandler in that fight. He's just had so many more fights recently, has had a lot of high-level experience. And I haven't loved what I've seen from Conor in his recent fights, but I think it's going to be a great fight. I think it's a solid matchup.
I think you look at the fight, how Chandler does get clipped in the first round, whether that's Gaethje, Dustin, Charles Oliveira, even that suits Conor McGregor down to the T.
Yeah, I mean, I think if Michael Chandler fights smart, he can beat Conor McGregor. But if he wants to stand and bang with Conor McGregor, that'll probably be a mistake.
Obviously, you say you look forward to Dustin versus Justin. How do you see that one going to?
Oof, that'll be a volatile fight. I still would give the edge to Dustin. I know he won the first one. I think Poirier is still somehow underrated in this sport. And Gaethje too, to an extent. But man, I think that's just going to be a knock him out, drag him out war. And really, anybody can win that fight. It just depends on who the tougher man is that day.
Yeah, obviously, you say both men are underrated. It's probably because neither of them have gone on and won the championship yet at lightweight, both falling short, whether that's Charles to Khabib.
Yeah, I mean, I still think Dustin is one of the greatest lightweights of all time, even though he only held the interim championship. If you look at his resume, it's a pretty stellar resume at lightweight. So it's unfortunate that he didn't get a chance to win the championship yet, but I think that he may never get a chance to win it. Really, when you look at Islam as a stylistic matchup, I think it's going to be a tough matchup for him if Islam's still the champion. I think a Volkanovski versus Poirier fight would be fun if Volkanovski is somehow able to get it done against Islam. I think that might be Poirier's best chance to win the championship, but I'm not sure if time's passed him by yet. I still think that he's incredibly talented and as good as anybody else in the lightweight division. Just he's just had trouble when it gets to the absolute highest level of the division.
So it's even Dustin, he's pretty much beat and fought the who's of the weight division, whether that's Conor, Eddie Alvarez, Justin, Showtime Pettis, pretty much everyone, and Anthony and Max Holloway when he came up for the interim belt.
Yeah, it's a stellar resume. It really is. And that's, again, why I think he's one of the greatest lightweights. Like, I'd put him in terms of all-time lightweights against, over a lot of different former champions in the UFC's lightweight division. So I think that he deserves his flowers. It's just too bad that he never became the undisputed champion.
Do you think obviously talking about Dustin, who do you think is the most underrated fighter in the UFC that doesn't get their props for his due?
Well, for a while it was Charles Oliveira, and then he did what he did, and I think he's gotten his props now. In terms of underrated, interesting question. I have to think division by division and see if there's anybody who comes to mind. It's a hard one off the top of my head because there are a lot of underrated fighters in the UFC, to be perfectly honest. I mean, Gaethje, I think, is pretty underrated. I know people, they think they know what they're going to get with Gaethje every time out, but man, he's tough. And he's another guy that I think is an all-time lightweight that was also just an interim champion, but another underrated guy. Yeah, it's weird to call him underrated. I mean, he's been a perennial top 5 guy in the lightweight division, right? So, I mean, people know about him. I'm sure there are people that are underrated that haven't gotten a chance to show what they can do yet because they haven't quite gotten to that top level. I think Arman Tsarukyan is very underrated, but again, another guy that's main eventing now, right? So it seems like the secret's out on him.
Yeah, well, you saw Dustin in the Rafael Fierza fight was like 3-1 underdog. I think I saw it on Bet365, which is crazy for what he's done in the sport.
Yeah, I don't know if he was that big of an underdog. I think when it closed, he was around plus 175 or something along those lines. But yeah, I was surprised by that too.
What do you say, like, obviously being an MMA journalist, what would you say, like, your worst moment or experience has been reporting on the sport?
I don't really have any that stand out to me. I mean, one thing that gets misconstrued is like, it's one of my best moments and also kind of one of my worst moments. It was when I was interviewing Israel and Jorge Masvidal knocked out Ben Askren. I feel like I could have done a better job in the moment. I looked like a deer in headlights because I kind of was. I didn't even realize that Askren versus Masvidal had started. I didn't know they had walked to the cage. I was just very laser focused on Israel, and I was interviewing him. I was all 100% focused on him. He was half focused on me and half focused on the Masvidal fight. That knockout happens. He falls to the ground and starts screaming, and I had no idea what was going on. I had no follow-up question prepared. It still ended up being probably one of the more viral moments in my career. Just in the moment, I wish I would have had a better grasp on what was going on, and just maybe just even asked him like, "Hey, what did you just see?" But instead, I was just kind of bewildered because I had no idea what was going on. So if I could change that moment, I probably would. But I still think it was a very important moment in my career because it was such a viral moment.
I think we were all shell shocked in a moment. Masvidal landed that knee in like 10 seconds or whatever it was.
Yeah, it was 5 seconds, and I was shell shocked for a different reason. The reason I was shell shocked is I didn't know the fight had started. I couldn't see the TV, right? So like all this stuff, all this hysteria was going on around me, and I had no idea why. I didn't even realize that they had even gotten to the cage yet.
We see that viral moment as you talk about being used for Masvidal promos, whether that's the Gilbert Burns fight or any Masvidal fight. We use that, see that clip as a promo clip now.
Yeah, it's always used whenever there's not going to be any more Masvidal fight weeks. It looks like, although you never know in the sport. But yeah, it's like it's been used a lot. And again, I don't mind it. Like I think it's an important part of my career, and I'm glad that moment happened. I just wish that in the moment I would have done a better job.
Well, Aaron, I know you're a busy man and got no more questions for you, so I'll let you go.
Thanks, Jay. I appreciate you thinking of me, and best of luck. If you ever need anything from me, just please let me know.
I will do. Thank you.